Hi YouTube, welcome to the channel. In this video, I'll show you how to use old PCs like these to set up a render farm in your house that you can use for Blender and other softwares. This is part one of a two-part series in which I describe how to set up a render server at home. I split this up into two videos because it's a lot of information and I didn't want to rush it or cram it into too short of a time. That way it is easier to understand. Part 1 will cover physically setting up a render node or a worker, however you'd like to call it, using one of my PCs as an example, and then we'll talk about how to install Windows. Part 2, after this video, will show the physical network that I have set up in my house, and then how to do all of the software networking so we can share files and spread out the rendering to multiple PCs. We'll start off talking about hardware requirements in Blender. On my screen here, I have the main homepage of Blender pulled up. You can type in blender.org to get here. If you don't already have it, you might as well download it. It's free, will always be free, and is very easy to run on basically any computer. So to check hardware requirements, we're going to go to the Download tab. This is also where you can download current and old versions of Blender. At the top of the screen, kind of in the middle, there's a Requirements tab, so click that. And this page will list out recommended and required versions of hardware and software and other things. This is definitely one place to look to start off, but there's so many different types of components out there that it's hard to generalize what you need. So if you're wondering what will work, you can ask in the comments and I will be able to help you, or come here and read around a bit and you can see what you can use that you might have laying around already. Okay, let's talk a little bit more about hardware now. This computer here was a PC that was in service at my day job, and when it was decommissioned, they let me take it for free. A lot of the PCs I suspect you guys will be using are kind of like this, where somebody had one, didn't really want it, and they gave it to you. So that's great. We just need to check and make sure that it will work and run fine. You need to make sure that your case is big enough for whichever graphics card you're going to put in. So here's a few different GPUs, graphics cards over here, and I'll talk about those in a second. Make sure that whatever you have or what you want to add to a system will fit, and that your power supply can handle powering that device. And that's something that you can look up online. Just look up the max power draw or the TDP of the card, and usually they'll just give you what kind of power connector is necessary. This is another PC that I had. It's a lot newer than the Dell that we were just working on. Blender is not officially compatible with PC hardware that is older than 10 years old. It may still work if it's that old, but they don't officially support it. I will actually put a list on the screen showing you for Blender 3.2 and above. For the next 10 minutes of this video, I'm going to go into more detail about especially graphics cards, but also some other minor details with PC hardware and compatibility. So if you want to skip to how to install Windows 10, then see the timestamps on the video and go ahead and jump to that. Otherwise, on the screen here, you can see a general list of the architectures, which is just the generations of graphics cards that are compatible for sure with Blender 3.2. AMD currently 6000 series and 5000 series from the RDNA generations, meaning the recent ones. So older Pro cards and stuff with those designations are not included in this. So if for AMD you want 6000 series or 5000 series, then for NVIDIA, as far back as at least Kepler, You can use any of the cards still. The biggest thing is a lot of the cheaper consumer cards from back then don't have very much VRAM. You know, you're looking at 1, maybe 2 gigs of VRAM. And the Quadros from back in the day, they are very power hungry, but they would definitely work. And the Quadros from that era did go up to 12 gigs of VRAM per chip, so those are feasible, but they're still not really cheap enough to justify it. While you go through this, if you have any other hardware questions you come up with, uh, definitely let me know in the comments. I have studied computer hardware extensively on my own in the last few years, and I would love to help you figure out what you need to know. Most NVIDIA GPUs that are modern, so within the last 6 or 7 years, will work just fine. AMD won't be able to render unless you get a 6000 series, so like RX 6400 and above, and then 5000 series is also supported, but the HIP renderer, which is in Blender, is the only one that AMD GPUs will use. They got rid of the support for the OpenGL, which used to run all of the AMD cards. So you just have to be mindful of that. They may add more support for newer AMD cards soon. But with that in mind, I do have just some general recommendations. What you have to realize is if your scenes are very complex and they exceed that amount of VRAM that you have access to, you're going to have to render everything on the processor itself. So if you know your scenes are already too big to fit on a GPU, then obviously don't spend any extra money on a graphics card because it's not going to be able to render anywhere near as fast as it could. In general, shoot for a higher VRAM amount from NVIDIA. I would recommend 3060 or 3060 Ti just because they're fairly fast, fairly small, and they have 8 for the Ti or 12 gigs for the 3060, so that's a lot for most people's scenes. The 3090 has 24, which is nice. And on my desktop, I actually have 2 of those that are using NVLink, which is like old SLI, but it allows the two 3090s to share their RAM, so I can use scenes up to 48 gigs on that. But that's fairly complicated for most people, and it's very expensive, so I wouldn't recommend going and buying that stuff unless you know you need it. From AMD, you know, you can base the same decision off of VRAM size, so something like a 6700 XT has 12 gigs of VRAM, and they're still fast processors. I'm not going to say they're slow, they're just a little slower than NVIDIA is right now. So if you're going to use those, you know, maybe judge that just on VRAM. If you have old GPUs sitting around, you can definitely try them. Go find the support lists and Blender's website to see what, you know, if it'll work at a glance. Otherwise, feel free to comment and ask questions. I know a lot about the hardware side. It's just there's so much that I can't generalize it right now. This is a Tesla K80, and as you can see from the 2 sets of the screws on the back here, this actually has 2 GPUs on it. It has 2 chips on the same board. And these used to be multiple thousands of dollars. They were for high-end servers that would do machine learning and other computation. Well, they're getting older now, and they're like 80 bucks on eBay. This thing has 2 cores. Each core has 12 gigabytes of RAM, so video RAM wise, they're decent, but this thing uses a lot of power. So this will use 300 watts, which is hard to power anyway. It has no display outputs, so you can't hook a monitor directly to this, which causes problems later on. And this is not actively cooled, so you have to either add fans to this, or this one under here is the same card. This one it still has the plastic shroud on it. I took it off of this one, but these are made for servers, so high-speed air blows through them and cools them. But in a normal desktop like this, you might have a fan at the front of the case or a few of them, and maybe some at the back of the case, but you're probably not going to have adequate cooling for something that's this hot. So while they're cheap, They're cheap up front, but over time, the difference in efficiency will start to cost you more and more money and time. So, about, I think, 8 of these will render almost as fast as one RTX 3090. And although you can get 8 of these for a lot cheaper than a 3090, the 3090 is going to be a better investment in the long run because it'll use up to 350 watts at the worst case and do as much as 8 of these, which will be, 2,400 watts to do the same work. So while you save money up front, you're going to lose it on power. So be mindful of that. But the kind of cards you'll find, these are Quadro, which were Pro Series cards. This one's very small. This is a K1200. It has 4 gigabytes of VRAM, which is okay, but may or may not be enough for what you're doing. But something like this is really nice because it does not require any extra power adapters inside the computer. So something like this, you can just plug directly into the motherboard, and it'll run from there. So if you have those kind of things sitting around, those are fine to use. Old consumer gaming GPUs. This is a GT 660, I believe. So pretty old NVIDIA GPU. It is still officially supported in Blender for now, so it'll run. It just won't be very fast, and this only has 2 gigabytes of VRAM. So the biggest takeaway here is don't spend too much on electricity just because you can get a deal buying something like a K80, while you can get a whole stack of them. Not only is the power bad, but you can only run one of these per slot on the motherboard. So here I could really only fit 2 of these, which means I have some overhead in that I have to build, to run 8 of those, I have to build 4 full PCs with all these other components in order to run that. So the expense just isn't worth it. And if you know your scenes are small enough to fit on VRAM, even an older GPU like, say, a Quadro from the Kepler years from the K series, so the bigger versions of them from this year would be like K4000, K5000, K6000 Quadros. Those have all of the normal display outputs and that kind of stuff. They're actively cooled, so you don't have to deal with figuring out how to cool them. But if you go get old cards like that, get enough VRAM, and then they're still definitely viable. And the reason is because of how Blender uses the cores in GPUs. Even an older mid to high end graphics card is going to match or be way faster than a newer processor. So, $800 of graphics cards made years ago will still compete with or beat a brand new $800 CPU. And usually it's by a lot. So definitely prioritize getting more graphics cards. CPU and RAM wise, you don't need a ton. If you're not going to render on the CPU, 8 to 16 gigs is plenty. And, you want to have probably at least 4 cores and 4 threads. And the more you have, the more scenarios you can basically protect your future self from having to deal with. But if you know you're not going to need the CPU rendering, then don't spend any extra money on that. Just make sure it'll run the graphics cards, because at the end of the day, those are what's really going to make up all the speed. And then one other note about hard drives. So this is a solid state drive. This is a more conventional HDD, which is a physical spinning disk. These are fine. They just run a little bit slower. For this purpose, that isn't going to hurt us. So if you already have it, you don't need to go buy new solid state hard drives or anything like that. They will boot faster, but it's probably not worth the extra expense. So I'll have the list of compatible GPUs on the screen here so you can see them. But otherwise, more modern cards with more VRAM is ideal. But old cards with high VRAM will also work as long as they're supported. If you already had the PC, you probably have a hard drive. And in the next steps, we're going to install Windows. So if you have files on those old hard drives, you want to make sure that you've backed them up, you moved them off of there, because when we install Windows, it's going to wipe the drive. So once you've got all of this stuff set up, though, then it's time to close the case, and we'll talk about setting up Windows. Okay, so I've got this PC set up. It's plugged into power, data, and then a mouse and keyboard. To install Windows, you're going to need some sort of Windows disk image. What you see on the screen now is a Windows installation disk. It comes with a copy of Windows that you could buy at the store. This will allow me to install Windows again on multiple PCs, but I will only have the original license, so my copies will not be registered to begin with. You can make your own USB drive to install Windows, and there's plenty of resources around the internet to show you how to do that. We're going to boot from this device here, so we'll plug that in the front, and then we'll start it up. Okay, this is my second monitor. I'm going to start up the new PC now. It'll take just a second to get going here. Every computer will have a different screen for its BIOS, is what it's called. So that won't always look the same. All right. Now this is running on the USB stick that I have in the computer. So I'm just going to start the Windows setup with a 64-bit. So just highlight it with the keyboard and hit enter. I'll come back once these files have loaded. Okay, once the files load, you'll get this screen. Select your keyboard layout and what languages you want the PC to run in. I'll hit next and then go to install now. In a second, we'll set up the hard drives to tell it which hard drive to put Windows on. But first, since I've already used the key for this Windows copy, just come down to this option here and say I don't have a product key. And it will let you install Windows anyway. To make our lives easier, we definitely want to use Windows 10 Pro. That should be just fine. And then click Next. Accept the terms. Okay, so then what I need to do is use a custom install. So I have all these partitions in here. If you're just trying to completely wipe the drive and restart with Windows, obviously, again, make sure your files are off of that drive, but then we can just start to delete all of these partitions. So I'll clear all of these out. All right, now we just have an unallocated drive. So all we need to do is hit next, and that is where Windows will install. All right, at this point, Windows is going to load some new files and some updates. So this will take a little bit. I'll let it load here for a minute, and then we'll be back to it. Okay, so Windows is just getting done installing the updates now. So you can let this screen run out or just hit restart now. And then at this point, you can pull out the USB stick, since Windows is already installed on the hard drive. So now, when it boots up again, you should just get the normal Windows 10 like you're used to. And you have to create a user. So just name the PC, give it a password that you're going to remember, or write it down. Because keep in mind, you may have multiple of these PCs, so don't make it something complicated, or you'll just add work for yourself later. But once all this is done, name it, give it a password. I always turn off all of the convenience features that Windows 10 offers, because these machines are not going to be something I work on. They're just going to render. And then once you do that, I'll show you how to configure the networking part of this so we can get to rendering. Okay, so Windows is installed, it ran its updates. There's a few simple settings that you will work through that are easy enough. Then we'll name this. I'm going to call this one R6 for the account name. And then I'm going to do the same exact thing for the password so they're easy to remember. And with stuff like this, you got to decide how much security you need. But on my local network, I'm not really going to need anything crazy. And then you can do security questions. Okay, I filled out the security questions. Normally for these machines, I just turn all of this stuff off. I have no need for a render machine to do all of this stuff, so I just disable it. If you're going to use the PC for other things, feel free to do whatever you want. Okay, Windows started up. So we have a few things we need to do. The icons will probably look weird because Windows does not start with the proper GPU display driver, so it doesn't know how to run the proper resolution until we update it. So the first thing to do is to go through your Windows updates. So just go into the Windows settings and go down to update and security. Even though we just installed Windows, it's going to have a bunch of stuff that it wants you to do. So definitely run through those. So I always run the check right away so it can kind of get that process rolling. And then for display drivers, you can run them and get them from the Windows Updater, which is this here. Or you can get NVIDIA or AMD's softwares for GPU drivers. So I know AMD has one. I don't remember what it's called. I don't use it. But NVIDIA's is GeForce Experience. So you don't need it, but I like to use it because it will also notify me of driver updates. And for newer cards, that can make a really big difference because driver updates normally follow major software releases. So anytime Blender has a really big release, the drivers probably add more support and speed it up. So I'm going to get GeForce Experience installed. To do that, just type in GeForce Experience and then install it. It'll ask you to make an account. So however you do that is up to you. And I'm going to do that real quick so we can get our drivers. And then I'll have to restart the PC. And so I'll do all that real quick. And then we'll come back and I'll show you the networking part. At this point, the hardware for this computer is set up and Windows is being updated. And we have all of the basic software that we need. So that'll do it for this video. I know this was kind of a long technical one. Let me know if you have any questions. The next one will be a little bit more to the point, and we'll show you how to set up the network software-wise, and then I'll show you how all of my Ethernet network is set up in my house, and I'll show you Remote Desktop app, which will allow you to sign in to your workers from your main computer so you don't have to get up and move files physically. And then we'll talk about sharing files. So that's coming up in the next couple days. Keep watching, and we'll learn more soon.